intentions lie dormant, and we're all to blame. While apathy acts like an ally, my enemy and I are one and the same. I don't know why the innocents fall while the monsters still stand, and our lies blow about like flags on the land. I don't know why our words are so proud and our promise so thin, and our lies blow about like flags in the wind. You who mourn will be comforted. You who hunger will hunger no more. And the last shall be first. Of this I am sure. You who weep now will laugh again. All you lonely, be lonely no more. Yes, the last shall be first. Of this I am sure. I don't know why the innocents fall while the monsters stand. I don't know why the little ones thirst, but I know the last shall be first. But I know the last shall be first, and I know the last shall be first.
Reading the second chapter of the first letter to the Corinthians. When I came to you, brothers and sisters, I did not come proclaiming the mysteries of God to you in lofty words and wisdom, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And I came to you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. My speech and my proclamations were not with plausible words of wisdom, but with a demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might rest not on human wisdom, but on the power of God. Yet among the mature we do speak wisdom, though it is not a wisdom of this age or the rulers of this age, who are doomed to perish. But we speak God's wisdom, secret and hidden, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But as it is written, what no eye has seen nor ear heard, nor the human heart conceived, what God has prepared for those who love Him. These things has God revealed to us through the Spirit, for the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. For what human being knows what is truly human except the human spirit that is within? So also no one comprehends what is truly God's except the Spirit of God. Now we have received not the spirit of this world, but the Spirit that is from God, so that we may understand the gifts bestowed on us by God. And we speak of these things in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual things to those who are spiritual. To those who are unspiritual, do not receive the gifts of God's Spirit, for they are foolishness to them, and they are unable to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. Those who are spiritual discern all things, and they are themselves subject to no one else's scrutiny. For who has known the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ.
I tried to keep you in a tent, I could not keep you in a temple or any of their idols to see and understand. We cannot keep you in a church, we cannot keep you in a Bible, or it's just another idol to box you in. They could not keep you in their walls, we cannot keep you in ours either, for you are so much greater. Who is like the Lord, the maker of the heavens, who dwells with the poor? He lifts them from the ashes, and he seats them among the princes. Who is like the Lord? Tried to keep you in our tents, tried to keep you in our temples. We've worshipped all our idols, we want all that to end. So we will find you in the streets, we will find you in the prisons, and even in our Bibles and churches. Who is like the Lord, the maker of the heavens, who dwells with the Lord? He lifts them from the ashes, and he seats them among the princes. Who is like the Lord? We cannot contain, we cannot contain the glory of your name. We cannot contain, we cannot contain the glory of your name. Who is like the Lord? You took me from the ashes, and you healed me from my blindness. Who is like the Lord?
A reading from the Gospel according to St. Matthew. You are the salt of the earth, But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but it is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under a bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. The gospel of the Lord.
Well, that was wonderful. Yeah, it was. I forgot my book. Thank you, Ryan, for taking the lead with the children and helping us to integrate them more effectively into our life of faith. Good morning, everybody. Hi. You heard the words of Jesus. God's people are a light to the world. They're salt in their world, a city on a hill. All things you've heard before, of course, no doubt. Metaphors that perhaps have been worn out in Christianity. A reminder, a challenge that may perhaps fall on deaf ears, as Jesus' words have either come to take on very little meaning or have come to take on the meaning of identity. Christians often hearing this text today may call to mind some kind of different or unique way of being culturally identifiable, leading us to separate from the world and stand in judgment over it, over struggling individuals. But I think we can probably all agree that that's not what Jesus is getting at in those words, and as they are the call given to us today, we should be clear on them. So by the time we've reached the end of this sermon, I hope that we can hear again the words that we are salt and light and hold them in a new way, a renewed way. In order to do that, we will explore together the words of the prophet Isaiah, the words from 1 Corinthians, and we'll connect all of these to Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 5. Our journey towards the words of Matthew 5 is going to begin with a question that has been posed many ways, many times throughout all periods of human history. A question that has been wrestled with, that has vexed humanity. How do we not be undone by chaos? The struggle between chaos and order is one of the oldest stories told by humanity. Whether it's the Babylonian story of the goddess Tiamat, the force of chaos, killed by Marduk and thus providing a path for a cosmos of created order, or the less anthropomorphized story that we are familiar with in Genesis, where God hovers over the primordial waters, the formless void swirling with no sense of distinction whatsoever, and brings them together, separates them with land, and creates order out of chaos. These stories have been told as humanity looks out into the vast universe and says, nope, it's too big, it's too daunting, we're too small, and it's too frightening. And it's not just the grandeur of the mighty cosmos, is it? It's the threat of the flood, the attack of the wild animal, the flash of the spreading flame. There are so many forces in our world that threaten to undo us at every turn. And of course, on top of all that, unique to humanity, the chaos of our own internal worlds. The threat of other people who are just like us but live over there, attacking, stealing our land, threatening our resources. All threats of the ancient world, all existential threats in our own minds today, threats from which these stories of chaos and order emerge. We still attempt to answer those questions today, and some have taken it upon themselves to directly address this struggle between chaos and order. I took my sons this week to Barnes & Noble. I'm very lucky that they love going to Barnes & Noble because I love going to Barnes & Noble, right? And so it is a thing I can actually use, right? Hey, let's go to Barnes & Noble. Yeah, right? It's great. It's selfish, but it works. It's not selfish. I'm just kidding, guys. It's because you like to do it. And it's not always just walking around Barnes & Noble, if I'm honest, right? I know, we usually leave with something. And Britt reminds me that I don't need to do that every time. But if my children ask me for a book, it's basically going to be a yes. I'm confident enough to say that in front of them. Well, we were there this past week, and you know how they put out all these various books, there's displays. I'm not sure how it works. I don't know if they have deals with certain authors, or if they do it based on what they think will sell, or what is currently selling, or whatever, right? But there's special displays of like new releases and top sellers and things like that. Well, there's this new book out that actually has the idea of order in the title, right? The subtitle is Beyond Order. The actual title is 12 More Rules for Living. And as I was flipping through it, one of the chapters stood out to me in the table of contents. It was one of these rules for living. Do not be too quick to denigrate institutions or traditions. And that struck me because it's very adjacent to what we will see in the words of Isaiah, and it falls in line with the way that humanity has attempted to answer the question of order and chaos for millennia. See, the threat of being undone by forces of chaos leads us, humans, to form institutions. And we tell big stories to each other, stories of how we got here, stories of who we are, stories of where we're going, and they're passed down from generation to generation. And that provides a great sense of stability, right? A stability that allows humanity to build. You know, you put down a foundation, and you can build from there. One could make the argument that having the ability to tell ourselves stories about ourselves in this way, to create myth, to build institutions around these stories, is what allows humanity to be what it is, a vast species, right? No other mammal our size has as many individuals, right? A vast species, a building and creative species. And yet within our own tradition, there is a thread woven throughout the story that subverts this idea. Subverts the idea that a commitment to institutions actually promotes order. And in fact, tells us that it can actually lead us to the threat of chaos, both spiritually and physically. One can pretty easily imagine, of course, maybe elements of Hebrew culture, say, looking at the prophet Isaiah and his words decrying the temple and the kingship, and saying to the prophet, don't be too quick to denigrate institutions or traditions. One could imagine, and we actually have stories of this happening, people saying to Jesus, don't be too quick to denigrate your institutions and your traditions. In fact, as we saw from the text, Jesus directly addressed that. He must have been accused of this because he says, do not think I came to abolish the law and the prophets. But the commitment to finding protection from chaos and clinging to the order of institution, it's one of the oldest ways of thinking in our species. In fact, I was thinking about it this week. I thought about the Tower of Babel. The reason that came into my mind is Braylon was asking me about various Bible stories, and he asked me, what's my least favorite Bible story? And I was like, I don't know if I have a least favorite. I don't know, right? I knew it must have been something. I was like, what's your least favorite? And he said, that one where everyone used to speak English, and then God made them speak other languages. And I said, well, first of all, it wasn't English, because it was written before English was even imagined, right? And I said, secondly, God didn't scatter the people for no reason. It wasn't just I'm evil, right? Well, of course, then this launches into a 20-minute explanation from me about the Hebrew people and their distinction to their pagan neighbors and their stories, and it went on, right? I explained that the problem with Babel was this fierce centralization, commitment to the kind of temple that would have become the central place in that city, that would have enforced over the people, as the Hebrews most certainly witnessed with their Babylonian neighbors, a divine right of rule for their kings, a heavily taxed people from the priesthood, the use of a giant slave class to maintain all of it. A life that, unfortunately, we know, despite the prophet Samuel's warnings, the Hebrew people chose for themselves. There's a thread throughout the Bible, if we have the eyes to see it, that points out it is precisely these kinds of institutions that we build to protect ourselves from chaos that lead us into chaos. That's what we see in Isaiah chapter 58. The people apparently crying out because God isn't listening. Where's God? We're praying, we're fasting, we're doing all the things, right? We need protection, we need blessing, we need divine favor. We live in a world in which we are surrounded by various threats, and we need help. Why isn't God listening to us? We have the temple, we have the priests, we're fasting, we're offering sacrifices. Everybody knows, everybody in the whole world knows that this is what you do to get the ear of God. And Isaiah says, but is it though? Like, yeah, some gods demand that of you. Some gods ask for you to sacrifice maybe not only animals, but even human beings. Some gods require you to bring your grain and the various offerings of what you have produced with your labor and to bring it to the temple. Some gods awaken as you produce suffering for yourself through fasting or physical abuse. But Isaiah says, none of those things are what Yahweh listens to. Sure, they're part of the ritual, right? They're part of the cultic life of us as a people, Isaiah says, but it doesn't really do to make them the point of it all. Isaiah isn't calling for some kind of new culture entirely, but he's saying you've missed the point if you think any of that is what rescues you. You heard it read, what does the Lord require? The same question, remember, that Micah asked last week in our text. What does the Lord require? Isaiah gives the same answer as Micah, but we have it more unpacked this week. He says, look, when you fast, you're just serving your own interest because when you fast, you oppress all your workers. When you fast, you do it to quarrel and fight. It's not just the form of the ritual. It's not just a commitment to tradition. Right? We read this as modern people, and you can read so many commentaries, like especially the popular level ones. And even in the Bible, if you open up your Bible to this passage, it'll be like right worship. Right? And in a modern culture where like our religious life is so separate from our secular life, people read this text and they're like, worshipful expressions aren't valid without blah, 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 right? But for the people, there's not worship and regular life. There's just life. This is their life, right? Life in Israel is a religious, political life. There is no separating it. So it's not about like worshiping in a certain way. It's about their commitment to a tradition, their commitment to an institution. The prophet says those are not acceptable. They don't get you anywhere. None of the effect you want them to have will actually occur. If you want to do a fast, if you want to engage in a ritual that is meant to place you in line with God, Isaiah says, well, here's what it should be. Here's the fast that I choose: to loosen the bonds of injustice, to undo the straps of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break every yoke. It's amazing to find that the people are in bondage, and to ensure that they no longer are is to fast, is to engage in ritual. It's a powerful metaphor that Isaiah uses, that of a yoke, right? The device that you put on an ox so that they can pull something to plow a field. I mean, what a metaphor to refer to human beings. Isaiah says, go find the people who are burdened down like pack animals, right? Whose purpose in this world is basically the same purpose as an ox: to work hard and give them rest. Isaiah continues on. Is an appropriate fast not to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the homeless poor into your house, to cover the naked when you see them, not to hide yourself from your own kin, not to look away as someone approaches you? These are the things that Isaiah says lead to a place of order, of rescue, freeing us from that which undoes us. Isaiah introduces a metaphor in the text that's really important in both the tradition and trajectory of biblical metaphors of ancient times, but also in our quest to connect all of this to Jesus' words in Matthew 5. He says, if you do all of this, then your light will break forth like the dawn. Then you will cry for help, and God will say, here I am. Light in those ancient traditional stories is that which can break into the chaos of darkness. Remember, of course, the Spirit of the Lord hovered over the formless void, the raging deep, the blackness that swirled around. And the first thing that God speaks, let there be light. Light shines into darkness and allows us to distinguish. It allows us to move without falling. It allows us to be able to begin placing things and seeing patterns in an otherwise chaotic void. And Isaiah says to the people, you can be that creative factor. Your light will burst forth from you and shine out into the chaos, dispelling it. He says, do this by strengthening the temple and honoring the king. Wait, that's not what he said. No, caring for the worker and the homeless. He says it twice. He uses the metaphor of light 2 times in the text. If you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light will rise in the darkness. 2 times he used the idea of light, connecting it both times to the provision of good for those without. As I flipped through that book in Barnes & Noble, a book claiming to deliver individual people from the chaos that can overwhelm their lives, I didn't read every word of the book, I'll be honest. But what I didn't see anything about getting involved in movements that ensure labor is equitable and not exploitative. That's not the answer commonly given by those who are said to be wise according to the world around us. There are a lot of self-help books out there. Did you realize that? Did you realize there's a lot of self-help books out in the world right now? A lot of them. I shop at Target from time to time, and in the electronics section, there's TVs. And on the TVs, right, pretty smart, they'll advertise other things that Target sells, right? And a lot of them are books that have come out, and they'll do these little blurbs where the author will talk about the book they've just released. And most of the time, those are self-help books, right? And the basic gist of most self-help books is like adjust your thinking about yourself, and then you can move forward in a healthier, happier way, right? Like, you're not terrible. You don't suck. It's kind of the gist of all self-help books, isn't it? But for the life of me, I've yet to see a self-help book that says, do you want to be healthy and happy? Do you want to feel fulfilled in your life? Do you want to feel like you're not just hanging on and being blown around? Get involved in your local community to ensure there's no homelessness. Isaiah's pretty clear, isn't he? Pretty clear. I don't think you can be more clear than Isaiah is. And when you really think about it, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? What's going to make your life good as an individual? What's going to make your life good? Living in a world where life is good, right? Working for justice benefits all of us. But we've been tricked. The powers that be love all these books, right? They love us to think that we can just make our lives better on the secular side or get God's attention on the religious side through like these little individual acts of piety or whatever. But it's interesting to look at the words of Isaiah because Isaiah really has very little commitment to any of that. And very little commitment to what might be called institution or tradition, other than that which is seen from the tradition that relates to justice. Of course, if you were to read the books of Deuteronomy and Leviticus, they proclaim over and over again that the point of this covenant with the people and Yahweh is equity. You've been released from slavery. Don't be slave-owning types of people. But if you read those books, there's all kinds of other stuff too, isn't there? And of course, over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, things were going to shift, and certain parts would be emphasized and certain others de-emphasized, and that's just the way that institutions tend to work. They can be co-opted by various groups. The powerful can come to see that these texts enforce our kingship. Of course, by the time of Jesus, we see these texts and traditions had been utilized to ensure that the priesthood had grown wealthy and influential. And so the role of the prophet, the role of the Messiah, the role of the body of Messiah as we move into our time, is not to strengthen the institution or be careful about speaking ill against it, but is to find the element, the faithful element within any tradition or institution, the element that does fall in line with God's justice, and to remain faithful to that. And if there's any other part of it, then we can do away with it. And we can rail against it all we want. You have no kind of commitment. You have no sense to need to feel faithful to anything that does not fall in line with the ideas of justice we see in Jesus and the prophets. Even as those things come from our own tradition as Christians, there's so much within Christianity, right, that we really have no business being involved in and don't need to feel a commitment to ensuring continues on. The other thing we notice from the prophet Isaiah is that as we look at the context of these words, the book of Isaiah stretches over a couple hundred years. And when the actual words of the actual prophet Isaiah are first given in the first part of the book, it's many, many, many years before his warnings to the people are fulfilled in their captivity. It's tempting to look at our world, the things are the way they are, and say, it's not really that bad, right? We may not have the best labor practices, but it's not as bad as China. Or we may not have the best rhetoric around race. We may not have the best ways of talking about the non-citizen, but we're not Nazi Germany. Right? This can be the mentality sometimes. But in looking at the warnings of the prophets, we have to remember, yeah, not right now. But if we do not commit to justice, we will at some point be undone by injustice. In the history of humanity, there is not a case. There is not a case where injustice has not undone a people. Babylon, the Assyrians, the Hebrews, ancient Rome, it does not matter. For some reason, we can't seem to get that through our own heads, and we ignore the words of the prophets time and time again. The second thing we see from the prophet is that as we look at the actual historical movement in which these words fall, as chaos overcomes us and then becomes undone again as we do witness with our own eyes instances of injustice being done away with, we remember that that's also a long course. We remember, of course, the prophets Nehemiah and Ezra and how their rebuilding efforts took generations as well. It's an important thing to remember as we begin to explore here shortly our own role as being places of light, as places where light can emerge. You can't simply have a relatively small group of people like we are and then suddenly break the yoke of oppression. We will work to ensure that the homeless are provided for. And then suddenly God's like, oh, cool, you committed to it on one Sunday, and now, boom, darkness gone, everything's better. That's not how it's ever happened. It didn't happen for the prophets that way. While the movement to being undone by justice is long, so also the restorative movement of justice is long. These little things that we read in the Bible that might take us a whole hour if we were to sit and read Isaiah cover to cover span many, many generations. And so we must remember then that we are not called into flash moments or displays of justice, but we are called into a way of life, into practices that form within us this thinking, which is why we're here today. We must remember that we are called into a path, a journey, that we are called into being a certain kind of people. That then connects us to our text in 1 Corinthians, where Paul contrasts the wisdom of God with the wisdom of the world. The wisdom of the world, we've already seen it, right? We understand what this is. We've been exploring the wisdom that says the gods will listen to us if we build these successful institutions. The gods will listen to us when we have strong temples or kings or whatever. We can utilize the consolidation of power to ensure we are protected against our enemies, right? That's the wisdom of the world, the wisdom of Babel, of Babylon, of Rome. But Paul says the wisdom of God stands in contrast to that and is seen most clearly in the crucifixion of Messiah. The crucified Christ is the wisdom of God. We've talked about that before. We understand this. We're beginning to understand it at least. Letting go of that claim over dominating styles of power, relinquishing our claim to our own self-interest or our own ideals, and laying them down in honor of those who need it. Standing in solidarity and recognizing that the sight of God is with those who are killed by empire, not those who run it. But today, we want to highlight the fact that Paul says to the people, when I came for you for the first time, when I moved among you to share with you the good news of God's wisdom, I didn't do it with convincing words. I didn't try to prove this was the more rational thing. I didn't try to display to you that I'm smarter than you or smarter than the other people telling you something different. He says, I kept it pretty basic because that's what you were ready for. But there's more. The fact is that what we're doing here is part of this big mystery, Paul says, a cosmic movement of God. He doesn't really get into it in this paragraph. He talks about it a little more later, but in Ephesians and Galatians, other Pauline texts, we know that this mystery, we saw it in the beginning weeks of Epiphany, this mystery is that God is building up a new humanity, one where even people who should have never belonged together can dwell together in peace, unity, and creativity, and can build a good world. Right? It's a mystery because up until then, everyone had just assumed the way to change the world is to have the best empire. Paul says, no, we've discovered something new in Jesus. We've discovered that it is in the collectivization of people around love that we can witness the birth of a new world. That it is a mysterious thing, right? One that we don't even really know everything about now, is something we can cling to. I was reading the text from the Julian of Norwich this week. And you may remember her famous phrase, all will be well, and all manner of things will be made well. But in the text where she's discussing this, she had a mystical experience of God in which she realized and had been told by God that all things will be made well. Very much in line with the trajectory of the prophets in the biblical text. But she's talking about this, right? This experience, and she's trying to teach it to other people. And she says that we have to have the faith to commit to this, even though it's long. And even though we don't see it. And interestingly, she points out a very specific tension for her that I think is important for us. She was Catholic. Lived in the world where every single human being was Catholic, right? There was no option in her day. She says there's a tension in the teachings of the Catholic Church and the promise that all will be made well. And she says, obviously it is part of our holy faith that some who reject Christ will be relegated to eternal punishment. Obviously, that's part of Catholic teaching still today, right? And part of a lot of Christian teaching. And she says we can look at that concept and we can say, well, how is that all things being made well? She doesn't come to an answer other than she says, all things will be made well. She doesn't come down forcefully on it, perhaps because she would have been burned at the stake, as some who were more forceful, like Marguerite Porete, were. My point in bringing this up, right, is to celebrate her tension and to realize that for all of us, there are things in our world that don't line up with our commitment to the fact that God is restoring the world. Whether it's your own personal beliefs, like Julian of Norwich, whether it's your experiences of the world around you as we look around and say, I don't think justice is on its way, right? Whatever it is, we often feel like things don't add up. And Paul realizes this. And he tells the Corinthian people, the more you grow in your faith, the more this mystery comes to be understood for you. And it comes to be impactful for you. But even without understanding the mystery, Paul says, even without that, you don't have to be Paul. You don't have to be Julian of Norwich. You don't have to be Isaiah or Jesus. Even without having this direct connection to the mystery of God's renewal of all things and all people, Paul says all you have to do is live in the example of the crucified Messiah. You're not going to be able to affect the outcomes, right? You're not going to be able to ensure that justice arrives for all people. But you can live with humility and you can choose justice. I actually think that's a really freeing thing, right? It's when we think we have to produce the solution that things can get out of hand for us. You don't have to have anything figured out. You don't have to understand all the ramifications of your actions. You don't even have to worry about the ramifications of your actions. That's the wisdom of the world. Planning, thinking through what might happen if this, right? The infinite chess game of action. Paul says all you have to do is follow the path of the crucified Messiah. We hear it a lot, right? Well, if we make this policy change for the homeless, are they just not going to work? You can't just give people things because then they'll rely on them. Well, don't people have to take personal responsibility? Yeah, but none of that actually matters. Right? It doesn't actually matter. You don't have to figure it out. You don't have to know the mystery of justice. You don't have to consider whether things will be worse than they are now if you are pursuing what the prophets tell us to pursue. To take our example, why would somebody write a book and part of that book say, do not be quick to denigrate a tradition or institution? Well, the thinking is if you too quickly tear something down, then you might be left with nothing, which would be chaotic, right? Or we can't be left with nothing as humanity. So whatever takes its place next might be worse than we had before. But that idea of it might be worse than we had before is quite possibly the greatest threat to movement that we face as people. And we're not called, nowhere in the Bible are we called to figure out if things will be worse than they were before. That's not faith. We commit our actions into God's hands. We are called to the right action. We are called to tangible, specific things. How specific was Isaiah, right? Isaiah doesn't let us off the hook with the typical Christian thing of like, love everyone, love people. You gotta care about people. No, he says like, the homeless must have food, and the naked must be clothed, and the worker must not be oppressed, right? Specific things. That's all we have to worry about. We don't have to worry about anything else. Yeah, it probably will lead to chaos. That's an important piece of this, right? Do you think the scene at the crucifixion was orderly? It was horrifying. It was terrifying. Remember all the biblical imagery that happened as Jesus died. Darkness overtakes the land. The earth shakes violently. The veil of the temple is torn. Chaos came on that day, right? The created order was uncreated. Visible institutions were shown to be inadequate. It's right there for us in the story. And yet Paul says that's the site of salvation and rescue. We can now see how meaningful and impactful Jesus' words can be for us in the gospel. You are the light of the world. That phrase can become trite, but now with this background of Isaiah, this background of what light is, this creative force that drives out darkness, we can see what's at play here. Jesus has just said right before this, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, blessed are those who make peace in the world, blessed are those who pursue justice with everything they have and hunger for it because they will be filled with it. And then he says, you, those people, are the light of the world. Jesus quotes Isaiah more than any other prophet. And I don't think it's a stretch to say here that this Sermon on the Mount is drawing from the ideas of Isaiah 58. You pursue justice and your light bursts forth. Jesus says you will be sitting on a hill, right? Sitting on a hill. People will look to you and stream to you, just like Isaiah says. He also uses the metaphor of salt, that which is used to preserve or to stave off the infectious growth that can cause things to be unsafe to eat. Think about salt. Think about light. Think about light shining in the darkness when you're not ready for it. It's uncomfortable, isn't it? As I was thinking about this, I was thinking of the scene from National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. When Clark Griswold finally gets his lights to work, and there's too many. It's so bright, and it bursts through the window of his next door neighbors that he always has this tension with, and they're blinded by it, and they're tripping, and the lights go on and off several times, and every time they're blinded again, they trip and fall. And at the end of that scene, right, they're sitting, having fallen down the stairs, disoriented, disheveled. Their house is a complete wreck because everything's been knocked over every time they trip. Right? That's what sometimes it looks like for light to shine in. It's not always orderly and nice, right? Sometimes when you turn the lights on in a room, you're like, uh-oh, things are kind of messy in here. Sometimes our world, Britt was talking to me about this, can feel very orderly, very nice and segmented. Oh, we live over here and those people live over there because they're a different color. Oh, we have this and they don't have that, but it's okay because they didn't work hard. And when we turn the lights on, we might say, uh-oh, things are a mess. Things are a mess. It's going to take a long time to clean this up. It may feel chaotic and disorderly to shine light. Have you ever gotten salt in a wound? It doesn't feel good. It's not pleasurable. It hurts. It's not always fun. We are light, we are salt. We can't hide it. We can't lose that saltiness, Jesus says. Or else, what is the salt good for at that point? to be thrown in the garbage, right? It's just worthless. Like, what are you even doing? Why would you put a light under a basket? You wouldn't be able to see from it. It's just silly. It's actually a really encouraging thing for Jesus to point this out, right? What we do matters as salt and as light, as people who have come into contact with this idea of God's kingdom. And it is just ours to remain faithful to it, to not forget it, to not let it go, to not buy into the world's wisdom. There's perhaps a threat as we hear this, a temptation to think, oh man, we're not doing it right. We're bad. But my point here is that Jesus had to tell even the people around him, and that Paul had to remind the Corinthian people. We all need reminders. It doesn't mean we're bad people. It means that we're on a path and that our formation isn't done. So along with all of those early listeners, we commit again each Sunday, each day really, to embrace the mystery of God's restoration of people. We commit again to living the way of the cross and standing with those who suffer. We commit to bringing light into darkness and reject the wisdom of the world that tells us, well, things will be harder if we do the right thing. Or that's not really any way that it's feasible. Or, well, that's not my decision. You got to go to someone above me. All of these things are the wisdom that stands in contrast to God's wisdom. But Paul says that's being made to look foolish. So may your faith grow. May you be of the path of the crucified one. May you listen to the voices of the prophets and Jesus. I hope that you'll be with us next Sunday at 9:30 a.m. as we begin to plan our role in the Nehemiah action on March 20th. As we begin to remember how many times Nehemiah potentially had to meet, how long this rebuilding process was for the Hebrew people, as we're reminded of our long path of justice. It's long, but it's our work. So I hope you're here next Sunday at 9:30 as we plan for the coming weeks, as we become encouraged and re-energized again around our efforts so that we can reflect Isaiah 58. I hope you carry the words of Isaiah 58 in your heart. Go read them again. Really let them sink in, because they're pretty unsettling when you think about it. And it's amazing how radical it really is, the things Isaiah says. You know, a beautiful thing in the words of Jesus is that he says, people will see your good work and glorify God. It's interesting to know he says they will see your work. Not you, not me. They may not see us. When someone moves into a home that they can afford because you helped ensure that our county has that in the budget, they won't know you did it. When someone receives a civil citation for a traffic offense rather than a lifelong arrest record, they won't know that you told your story in a listening meeting. They won't know that you came to the Nehemiah action. But God will be glorified in their reception of justice. Your work will be a building block in the new world. In doing this together, we can pray with all faith, with all confidence, that God's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Let's pray. God, we need more than we have. We can't keep up with the demands on us. We can't keep up with the way the world guides us into injustice. It's just too deep-seated. It's everywhere. And we admit before you that we have no plan of action. We have no really way of countering it or compensating for it. And so we just ask in hope and in faith that you change our hearts. We ask that you give us just the smallest hint of courage, that we take your word seriously. We ask for just the smallest sliver of faith, that we can imagine what life might be if we took your prophets and your Holy Son seriously. We ask that you just give us a glimpse of the light that would occur if we were a community that loved each other and supported each other so deeply that people looked at it and said, yeah, that would be nice if I had something like that. And we ask for the strength to do it. The strength we will receive in faith through the gifts you have given us. In Jesus' name, amen. On the night that Jesus was betrayed, he took bread and he took wine and he broke the bread and he blessed it and he passed it out in gratitude. And he took wine in the same way and he poured it and he blessed it and he passed it out and he said, "This bread is my body broken. And this wine is my blood poured out." Not randomly or magically or accidentally, but because there were people who did not want him speaking. Because wisdom says, get rid of the salt in the wound. Get rid of that element of chaos. We don't need that. And yet, along with millions of others throughout thousands of years, we today commit to do this action in remembrance of that Christ. Hoping against hope that his life fill us and spill out so that everyone may receive the good blessing of God's world. Before we partake together, join me together in a prayer. The bread of love, a large table is waiting. The cup, the wine, and the triune God will not all be healed. Struggles, hardships, tiredness, all have a place here. So do dreams and hopes. They will break bread together. Here there is equity, a just table, the bread of freedom. In each embrace, the joy of community. This is the celebration of we who still want to believe. We who embrace God's tomorrow. Renew our faith, renew our faith, renew our faith. Amen.